At 60 years old, Lorraine Brooks was lying in a hospital bed, staring at a ceiling she could barely keep in focus anymore, while the machines beside her counted time in a way her body no longer could. The doctor had already said it, twice, carefully, slowly, like he was trying to give the words a softer landing, but there was nothing soft about what they meant. She needed blood. Immediately. Without it, she would not survive what was coming next. Her children were standing right there when he said it. Close enough to hear every word. Close enough to save her life. But neither of them moved. Not her son. Not her daughter. They stood there in silence. Not shocked. Not confused. Just still. And then, without saying it out loud, they made a decision that would follow them for the rest of their lives. They chose not to help her. But what happened next, no one in that hospital saw coming. Because the man who would walk through that door later that day wasn't family. Wasn't expected. And the moment Lorraine saw him, she broke down in a way that didn't make sense, until the truth finally came out. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Lorraine Brooks had spent most of her life being strong in ways nobody ever stopped to question. The kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, doesn't demand recognition, but shows up every single day whether anyone notices or not. She had raised her children in a small apartment that always smelled faintly of laundry detergent, and whatever meal, she had stretched just enough to last through the week. There had been no safety net, no backup plan, no second income waiting quietly in the background. Just her. Always her. When Marcus was 9, he had asked her once why she never rested. Lorraine had smiled, brushing his hair back gently, and said, "Because we're building something." He didn't understand what she meant then. Truthfully, neither did she, not in a clear, defined way. All she knew was that she was working toward a future where her children would never feel the weight she carried. And she succeeded. Marcus grew into a man who understood structure, money, control. He built a life that was stable, predictable, safe. Elise grew into someone polished, composed, careful about how she moved through the world. Lorraine had given them both everything she could. But somewhere along the way, they stopped seeing her. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. It happened slowly, quietly, in small moments that didn't seem important at the time. Missed calls that weren't returned. Visits that became shorter. Conversations that felt more like obligations than connection. Lorraine noticed. Of course she noticed. But she told herself what mothers like her always tell themselves. They're busy. They're building their lives. This is what I worked for. Until now. Now she was lying in a hospital bed, weaker than she had ever allowed herself to be. And for the first time in her life, she needed something from them. And they couldn't give it. Or wouldn't. Marcus had been the first to speak, his voice controlled, measured, but distant. He mentioned something about his health, something vague, something that sounded just real enough to avoid questioning. Elise followed, wrapping her refusal in softer language, mentioning anxiety, fear, discomfort. Lorraine listened. Really listened. And what she heard wasn't fear. It was hesitation. It was distance. It was the quiet sound of people who had already decided and were just finding the words to make it acceptable. "It's okay," Lorraine said finally, her voice softer than she expected. And the moment she said it, she felt something inside her settle in a way that was unfamiliar. Not peace. Not acceptance. Something else. Something quieter. Something final. 2 floors below, Daniel Reyes had no idea that his life was about to cross paths with a story that had been unfolding long before he was even aware of it. He stood in the hospital kitchen, finishing the last of his shift, moving with the kind of steady rhythm that came from years of doing the same work, day in and day out. Cooking had always been more than a job for him. It was structure. It was something he could control. Ingredients made sense. Effort made sense. You put something in, you got something out. Life had never worked that way for him. He had grown up in a system that taught him early not to expect permanence. Foster homes, temporary placements, different last names on paperwork that never quite felt like his. He had learned how to adjust, how to move forward without asking too many questions, because questions had a way of leading nowhere. Still, there were moments. Moments when he would catch himself wondering, who did I come from? Did they ever think about me? Was I forgotten? Or let go? He didn't dwell on it. Not anymore. Life had given him enough to focus on in the present. A job. A routine. a sense of independence that had taken years to build. But absence doesn't disappear. It just becomes quieter. As he wiped down the counter and reached for his jacket, something near the exit caught his attention. A notice posted slightly crooked, the edges curling just enough to show it hadn't been there long. Urgent donor needed. AB negative. He paused. Not because he had to. Because something told him to. He stepped closer, reading it again, slower this time. He knew his blood type. Rare. Valuable in moments like this. He looked at the time. He could leave. Go home. Forget he ever saw it. Most people would. But something about it stayed with him. Not urgency. Not obligation. Something else. A pull he couldn't explain. And before he gave himself time to think it through, he turned around and walked toward the donor desk. Upstairs, Lorraine lay in silence, the room heavier now that her children had stepped out again. Their absence felt louder than their presence had. She turned her head slightly, her eyes drifting toward the window, watching the faint movement of people far below, all of them living their lives without knowing that hers had narrowed down to this moment. She didn't feel angry. That was the strange part. She felt clear in a way she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she wasn't making excuses for anyone, not even them. And that clarity was just beginning. The knock on the door came softly, different from before, not rushed, not routine. She opened her eyes, and everything started to change. The knock on the door did not sound like urgency. It didn't carry the rushed rhythm of nurses moving between responsibilities or the clipped efficiency of doctors delivering updates. It was softer than that. Intentional. Almost hesitant. Lorraine turned her head slowly, her body still heavy from exhaustion, her mind moving just a little faster now that something in the atmosphere had shifted. When the door opened, the man who stepped inside did not belong to anything she had seen so far that day. He wasn't wearing a white coat. He wasn't carrying a chart. He didn't move like someone who had been in that room before. He stood just inside the doorway for a second, as if making sure he wasn't intruding on something he didn't fully understand. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low, steady, respectful in a way that felt almost out of place in a space that had become so clinical. "I was told someone here needed a donor." Lorraine blinked slowly, her mind taking a moment to connect the words to what they meant. For a second, she thought she might have misheard him. "Yes," she said finally, her voice quieter than she expected. "That would be me." He nodded once, stepping a little closer, but not too close. There was something careful about the way he moved, like he understood boundaries without needing them explained. "They said you're AB negative," he continued. "So am I." The room seemed to hold that sentence in place for a moment longer than it should have. Lorraine looked at him more closely now, not just at his face, but at the way he stood, the way his shoulders settled, the way his eyes moved, not avoiding her, but not staring either. Present. Grounded. There was something about that presence that made her chest tighten, not with fear, not even with relief, but with something she couldn't name yet. "You don't know me," she said quietly, almost more to herself than to him. He shook his head. "No, ma'am," he said. "But that doesn't matter." And something in those words, simple as they were, reached deeper than she expected. Because in a building full of people who had every reason to care, this man, who had none, was the one standing in front of her. Before Lorraine could respond, a nurse stepped in behind him, already explaining the next steps, already guiding him out of the room to begin the process. He gave her one last look before leaving, not lingering, not searching, just acknowledging. But Lorraine felt it. And when the door closed again, the silence that followed felt different than before. The hours that followed moved with a quiet urgency that Lorraine could feel even through the haze of her condition. Nurses came and went, voices low, movements efficient, everything unfolding just quickly enough to stay ahead of something no one wanted to name out loud. But Lorraine's attention wasn't on the movement of the room anymore. It was on him, even when he wasn't there. She found herself replaying the moment he walked in, the way his voice sounded, the steadiness of it, the absence of hesitation. She had spent her entire life reading people. You don't raise children alone without learning how to hear what isn't being said. And there had been nothing hidden in him. No performance. No calculation. Just presence. And that unsettled her more than anything else. Because it felt familiar. Too familiar. Marcus and Elise returned not long after the process had started, their energy different now. Not softer, not warmer, but more controlled, like they were managing something beneath the surface. Marcus asked questions, but not the ones Lorraine expected. He wasn't asking about her. He was asking about timelines, procedures, recovery expectations. Elise stood beside him, arms crossed lightly, nodding along, occasionally glancing at her phone. Lorraine watched them, really watched them. And for the first time, she didn't try to fill in the gaps between what they were doing and what she wished they were doing. She didn't soften it. She didn't excuse it. She just saw it. This man, Marcus said at one point, his tone measured, he's just a staff member? The nurse nodded. Kitchen staff, she replied. But he's a match. There was a pause. A small one. But Lorraine caught it. Marcus nodded slowly, like he was processing information that didn't sit the way he expected it to. Right, he said. Well, that's fortunate. Fortunate. Lorraine felt something shift again inside her at that word. Not anger. Not hurt. Just clarity sharpening. Because the man downstairs had not walked into that moment thinking about fortune. He had simply walked in. And that difference mattered more than anything anyone else in that room seemed to understand. By the time Lorraine was taken into surgery, the world had narrowed again, but this time, not into fear, into something steadier, something anchored. The uncertainty that had filled the earlier hours had shifted into something quieter, something that felt less like waiting and more like moving forward. When she woke, the first thing she noticed wasn't the room. It was the absence of that heaviness. Not gone, but lifted. Just enough. The doctor spoke first, explaining that the surgery had gone well, that the transfusion had made the difference they needed, that she was going to recover. Lorraine listened, nodding slowly, her body still catching up to what her mind was already reaching for. Where is he? She asked. The doctor paused for a second, then understood. He's still here, she said. He wanted to make sure you were okay. Lorraine closed her eyes briefly, something in her chest tightening in a way that wasn't painful, but deep. Can I see him? She asked. A few minutes later, the door opened again. And there he was. This time, Lorraine didn't just look at him. She studied him. Carefully. Sit, she said softly. He hesitated for a moment, then pulled the chair closer and sat down, his posture the same, steady, grounded, present. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lorraine said, slowly, carefully, "You feel familiar to me." Daniel didn't respond immediately, but something in his expression changed. Slightly. Just enough. I don't know why, she continued, but I felt it the moment you walked in. He looked down at his hands for a second, then back at her. I've heard people say things like that before, he said quietly, but not like this. Lorraine held his gaze. Tell me about yourself, she said. There was a pause. Then, after a breath, he said, I grew up in foster care. The room shifted. Not loudly, but completely. Lorraine's fingers tightened slightly against the blanket. I never knew my mother, he continued, or where I came from. I was told she couldn't keep me. That's all I ever got. Lorraine stopped breathing for a second. Not dramatically, just enough for the world to tilt slightly. When were you born? She asked, her voice quieter now. He told her, and everything fell into place. Not slowly, not piece by piece. All at once. The years. The timing. The loss she had buried so deep she stopped expecting answers. Her vision blurred as tears filled her eyes, but she didn't look away. You didn't walk into this room as a stranger, she said, her voice breaking for the first time. You came back to me. Daniel stared at her, the weight of what she was saying landing slowly, heavily, like something too big to process all at once. And Lorraine finally broke. Not quietly, not carefully, but fully, because the man who had just saved her life was the son she had lost decades ago. The room held the silence differently now. Not empty, not uncertain, heavy, with truth, with years, with everything that had been missing finally finding its way into one place. Lorraine's hand was still wrapped around his, her fingers trembling slightly, not from weakness this time, but from the weight of what she was holding on to. Daniel hadn't pulled away. He hadn't said anything yet. He was still trying to understand how a moment that began with a simple decision to donate blood had turned into something that was reshaping everything he thought he knew about his own life. You're saying, he began slowly, his voice careful, like each word needed to be placed exactly right. You're my mother? Lorraine closed her eyes briefly, a quiet breath leaving her before she answered. I'm saying, she said, steady but full, I never stopped being your mother. Even when I didn't know where you were. Even when I didn't know if you were alive. I never stopped. Daniel looked away for a moment, his jaw tightening slightly as he tried to hold on to something stable inside himself. They told me, he said, his voice lower now, that I was given up, that I wasn't wanted. Lorraine's grip on his hand tightened. You were never unwanted, she said, and this time there was no softness in her tone, only truth. You were taken. Circumstances I didn't have the power to fight back then. But you were never unwanted. Not for a single second. The door opened before he could respond. Marcus walked in first, followed closely by Elise. They both stopped the moment they saw them. Saw the way Lorraine was holding Daniel's hand. Saw the tears still sitting openly on her face. Saw something in the room that had shifted in a way they couldn't immediately understand. What's going on? Marcus asked, his tone sharper now, less controlled than before. Lorraine didn't let go of Daniel's hand. This is your brother, she said. The words didn't land gently. They dropped. Heavy. Final. And for a moment, neither Marcus nor Elise moved. That's not possible, Elise said quickly, her voice rising just slightly, not in anger, but in resistance. Lorraine turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting hers in a way they hadn't in years. It is, she said. And it's the truth. Marcus looked between them, his expression tightening, his mind already moving toward explanation, toward logic, toward anything that could make this not what it was. We would have known, he said. If there was something like this, we would have known. Lorraine held his gaze. There's a lot you didn't know, she replied quietly. And that silence that followed was no longer empty. It was revealing. Because for the first time, Marcus and Elise weren't standing in a position of understanding. They were standing outside of it. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, finally pulling his hand back, not out of rejection, but out of the need to steady himself. I don't want to make this harder than it already is, he said, his voice calm but firm. I didn't come here for this. I didn't even know this was possible. Lorraine looked at him, something soft returning to her expression. I know, she said, and that's what makes it real. Marcus let out a breath, running a hand through his hair as he paced once across the room. So what now? He asked, his tone no longer controlled, just unsettled. We're just supposed to accept that this man walks in here, and suddenly he's family. Lorraine didn't answer immediately. She looked at him, really looked at him. And for the first time, she didn't see her son as a child she had to protect or guide. She saw him as a man making choices. And she spoke to him that way. No, she said. You're not supposed to accept anything. Marcus stopped pacing. She continued. But you are going to understand something, she said, her voice steady now, grounded in something stronger than emotion alone. This man walked into this hospital today with no reason to care about me, and he gave something of himself without hesitation, without question, without asking what he would get in return. She let that sit. Then she added quietly, and the two of you didn't. That landed harder than anything else she had said. Elise looked away first. Marcus didn't respond, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. The truth had already done its work. Daniel stood slowly, his movements measured, his expression still trying to find balance between everything he was feeling. I think, he started, then paused, choosing his words carefully. I think this is a lot for all of us. Lorraine nodded. It is, she said. He looked at her, something softer now in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. But I'm not walking away from it, he added. And that was the moment everything settled. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Because this wasn't about fixing the past. It was about choosing what came next. 3 weeks later, Lorraine sat at her kitchen table, sunlight falling softly through the window the way it always had, but feeling different now. The house wasn't bigger. Nothing had changed physically, but the space felt fuller. Daniel sat across from her, a cup of coffee in his hands, listening as she told him stories she had carried for years with no one to give them to. Small things. Important things. The kind of details that make up a life. Marcus and Elise had come by earlier that week. The conversations had been difficult, uncomfortable, honest. But something had shifted. Not everything. Not yet. But enough to begin. And for Lorraine, that was enough. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't waiting for something to come back. It already had. And if there's one thing this story leaves behind, it's this. The people you give everything to will not always be the ones who show up when it matters most. And sometimes, the love you thought you lost forever finds its way back to you in ways you never expected. Family is not just about who was there in the beginning. It's about who chooses to be there now, who stands beside you, who gives when it's hard, who stays when it matters. So let me ask you something. Who in your life has truly shown up for you when it counted? Write their name in the comments. Just their name. And if this story touched something real in you, share it with someone who has never left your side. Because in a world where people walk away, the ones who stay are everything. And I'll see you in the next story. Thanks for listening.